Good afternoon. We're here with Father Patrick Daly, the General Secretary of the Commission of the Bishops' Conferences of the European Community, and we would like to ask you a few questions.
Certainly.
Our first question is, how would you define cultural diplomacy?
Diplomacy is the building up of relations, developing mutual understanding between people who are different, or who have different interests, between nation states, for example, or who have disagreements, or who are trying to achieve something in common. So if we define diplomacy as that, then I would say that cultural diplomacy is an exchange as well as a sharing of our common culture, but also celebrating difference. So most Western European countries have a common artistic and musical culture, and yet the exchange of great works of art from one national museum to another, or orchestras such as the Berliner Philharmoniker, which visit London or Dublin if they should do so, are part of the deepening of our common celebration of a culture we share, but where one country contributes something of its geist or its spirit, so that there is a difference as well as a common shared value system. So that's the way I see it in just very vague terms. That's how I would understand it. Yep.
That wasn't vague at all. That was wonderful.
Good, I'm glad.
Can you give us an example, because we're here talking about interfaith dialogue, can you give us an example of interfaith dialogue that maybe in your work or your experiences?
Yeah. I certainly can. I was the parish priest in a town called Wolverhampton in the West Midlands of England, a town which had a strong industrial life in the earlier part of the 20th century, which had various layers of migrant populations coming in there, the Irish, which I am to start with, and then in the 50s and 60s, large numbers from Asian communities from Africa, and then communities from the Caribbean. And then in latter years, particularly around the year 2000, large numbers of asylum seekers, Kurds from Afghanistan or from Iran, were brought into the city for a whole variety of reasons we needn't go into. So you were dealing there with a multicultural environment. Many of them were young, many were Islamic. We had a large section of Greek students, for example, at the university, and the dominant culture is, of course, English and Anglican. The Catholic community is fairly strong for historical reasons, again, disproportionately strong in Wolverhampton. And I would say there's a great deal of social harmony in a city which has to cope with big problems such as unemployment, crime, a drugs culture, and above all, a city very harshly affected by globalization. And so in all of those things, the community had to come together, and the obvious place was for the religious communities to somehow establish at least a dialogue, to talk to one another, to understand one another, and to see was there any common social project, such as urban renewal, such as, for example, protection of vulnerable people, such as assisting the police in controlling crime, that we could do together, and we did. So that's my experience really of interreligious dialogue. So it wasn't about theology. I think that's more difficult. It wasn't about even about our cultures, because again, for reasons which I outlined in my presentation to the Assembly, again, I think that is more difficult and problematic. But certainly on a practical level, we do have a common humanity. We have common interests to defend, the well-being of our families, the security of our property, etc. And so you can bring people together for that reason. And in England, it has to be said that one of the things which we commonly own and which is highly intercultural is the national health system. Great. Okay.
Thank you. In Northern Ireland in particular, there are still issues between Protestants and Catholics and a lot of unresolved issues there.
Absolutely.
So what do you think can be done there to promote interfaith dialogue?
Well, yes, I mean, I have a particular view of Northern Ireland which perhaps is not relevant in this context. I would say that the same principles which I outlined in the presentation, namely that we listen to and hear one another's stories with a sympathetic ear, And that is precisely, I think, the problem in the 6 counties of my country, that both communities tell their story in pageant, in the marching season, in their very, very visceral attachment to symbols such as flags and wall paint murals on the wall, and there's a provocative element to the cultural expression as well. It's not a peace-seeking transmission of the cultural story. Unfortunately, it's a provocative one. And I understand the need for it. It's about identity. It's about the preservation of identity against a perceived threat. But it certainly is not something which helps dialogue. So I would have thought that, for example, and again, this is a purely personal view. I don't know what the view of Catholic bishops is in the north of Ireland, but I would say that the marching season is somewhere where a huge restraint has to be exercised and ecumenical leadership has to be shown, because it tends to be very provocative and incites to violence and is essentially a tribal conflict that has really very little to do with religion, if nothing.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry for being a bit strong in
No,
my views on
no,
that
that's
subject.
great. Yeah, I'm very interested in that, so thank you.
Yeah, okay.
We've heard a lot this week about political leaders instrumentalizing religion for political gain. So how do you see the relationship between religion and politics, and how can we keep politicians from abusing religion for their own political gain?
Well, I don't have an immediate quick answer to that question. I think that my principal concern, for obvious professional reasons, is Europe, is inter-religious dialogue within the forum of the European Union. And I would say that if there is an ideological conflict, it is between what is perceived as religious belief and its secular opposite. And I think that the European identity is a multi-layered one. We have various identities at various times. You know, sometimes I'm acutely aware of being a Catholic and being a priest, for example, in Rome, whereas in Brussels I might be less aware of that. I might be more conscious of being a European, of being somebody who has even though I am a Catholic priest, has also a secular mission. And I think that is true of most people, that sometimes we feel Catholic, sometimes I feel Irish. St. Patrick's Day is an obvious time. And sometimes I feel European, such as I feel at home here in Rome. I speak Italian, as it so happens. But not only that, I feel very much that the continent of Europe is my home. So there is a sense of belonging, what the Germans call Heimat. And I think that for all European citizens, this multi-layered thing is important. And religion is a part of our identity. Sometimes when we're at church on Sunday, or when we're talking about values, or when we're talking about culture or an art gallery, we're more conscious of being Catholic or Christian than maybe when we're involved in economics or in business or out in a restaurant. So I would say that the religious element to the complex identity has to be included, but it to be included as an enrichment, as an added value, as something which is essential to many human beings, but is something positive. You know, I'm happy about being a Catholic. I'm proud of being a Catholic. I'm not shoving it down your throat necessarily, but I'm happy to be a Catholic, and as a result of my Catholic convictions and identity, I am also happy to be a European, and the two things are to be complementary, and I would hope that they enrich one another. Okay. Is that that an answer to the question? Okay.
Definitely.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Not at all. My pleasure. Yeah.
It's been a pleasure and privilege to have you here today.
Thank you very much indeed, and I hope that what I've shared with you has enriched your own understanding of the intercultural dialogue.